To be here. Let's get started because I have so many things to share with these 45 minutes. So today talks, it's about design tools, how it close the gap between designer and developers. But I think an alternative title will be better for you guys to have, to know what kind of things that you can bring home. So what to expect as Android developers from designer for design handoff. And I thought it's a very important topic to talk about. So in a not so distant past, like 7 years ago, if you ask designer, what kind of tool that they use to design screen mockup, for example, they definitely tells you Photoshop, Illustrator, or Fireworks. Problem with this tool, especially Photoshop, is not designed for the digital product designer to do all these things more efficiently. But fast forward to today, there's so many new tools out there that helps designer to do their work more efficiently. But of course, you might be asking, why should you care as a developers? The thing is, from my point of view, besides making the design work more efficiently, it actually helps designer to produce a much more consistent and also more efficient way to produce a design handoff for the developers to do the implementation. So I thought it's something that you guys as a developer should be aware of and what kind of things that you can expect from designer. So of course, there's this famous debate online saying that, hey, should designer code or should engineers design? But I mean, ideal case, of course, you will have someone who can code and design at the same time. But before we reach to that stage, of course, definitely designer need to know what kind of things that they can provide to developers and what kind of things developers can expect from designer. So let's get started. So first is about visual design. We use these design tools to do a lot of visual design like mockup. We also use it to do icons and illustrations. And of course, one of the tools that really great, really coming in the right time is Sketch. I'm pretty sure you heard about it. If you haven't heard about it, it's an application in Mac. It's basically a vector editor, but it's designed in a way that really meant for digital product designer to do screen mockups, to do anything related to digital product. And of course, there's our alternative right now, which is equally capable and even more powerful, like Adobe Experience Design, Framers, Graphic Designer, or Figma. So let's just touch on the mockup, okay? So for Android design, in Fabulous, what we start is always with this base size, 360 times 640, which is always the best size to start the design with, because that's where you have the constraint to ensure that you don't put in too much things that doesn't work on the smaller screens. So, but when you design in Android, of course, you need to think about responsiveness. There's so many Android devices with different screen sizes out there. So designers' responsibility is to think about this possibility of running the app in different screen sizes. So when they design in the base resolution, they also have to already have this thinking in the design. So why these base resolutions? One advantage that we see is, of course, it's actually sitting in the MDPI density bucket, so it's 1x. So the advantage of doing this size is because it helps a lot in spec handoff and also generating the assets for the developers. For example, if you see from the design, the gap between the cards and the label is 24 point in Sketch. It means 24 dp. It's a direct conversion. It's so simple. So you might be asking why it should be this size instead of like the larger size like on the Google Pixel. So let's do a comparison. In Google Pixels, if you turn it to a 1x bucket, you can see that there's extra screen space. I can tell you that's a very dangerous thing to be available for the designer because we tend to put in more stuff in it. And that could result in a bad UI because when you shrink the screens to smaller devices, things probably will not work as intended. But is that all? Is this 360 is the best resolution? So far, it's the best. But there's also a new Android called Android Go. And the target resolutions or the devices out there running Android Go have a smaller screen size, actually. So in this case, as you can see in the pricing plan in Fabulous, it's run fine, totally fine on 360s with screen size. But on a smaller screen, it actually needs a little bit more extra responsiveness in it to ensure that the UI is not blocked or is not hidden when the user interacts with the screens. So this is something that designers should also anticipate and also coming up with the solutions or at least the idea to the developers. So the developer will be able to know what to do when the screen size is smaller. And also, of course, with these new design tools like Sketch, the design template is there. Like, for example, material design, you have the design template there. So what you can expect from designer is a much more consistent design in terms of, across the screens. I still remember back then when we used Photoshop, we tend to build some of the elements from scratch. So there could have some inconsistency between screens. So this is going to be not going to be happen so often with Sketch and all the new design tools. So for visual design, what I think as a developers, what we can expect from designers is, of course, screen design in base resolutions, which is the best size, 360 width. So any larger screen, smaller screen is still pretty much responsive. And also more consistent design. That's very important because you will be confused, like this button is having a 2dp corner radius and the other one have 3dp and you're not sure which one to follow. So that's visual design. Then of course that's the base, static mockup. So to implement that, of course, designers' responsibility is to produce the design assets for developers. That's no question about it. So let's talk about the UI itself, where first thing first, the designer's responsibility is to identify what kind of design assets is needed to be generated or extracted from the design. So it's their responsibility to ensure that the extracted assets is usable, and also which part to extract. For example, like icons, illustrations in the app. And also knowing what kind of things that doesn't need to extract. For example, the fab, the cards, the shadow, those are the things that designer doesn't have to generate because it's already doable in the codes. But knowing which part is the first, second part is about giving the correct format. So PNG is, of course, the best format in Android, but for icons or less complex images or icons, using vectors is not a bad idea as well. So SVG is good. But also for images like illustrations that doesn't need transparency information. It's also a good idea to look at whether converting to JPEG is a good idea because PNG, sometimes it can be having a larger file size, which I will show you a little bit comparison later. So as a developers, definitely what you can expect from designer, it's not something you should do. Designer will have to provide you the design assets in different DPI. And of course, if you talk about vectors, definitely just at 1x, SVG, you can use it as a SVG using third-party library, or vector drawable as a vector drawable. But if you are interested in vectors workflow, definitely go to Nick's talk last year, which is really great, giving me more information there. So that's about the format. Then let us look at just one piece of UI in the home screen in Fabulous. So it looks like a normal card, but when you explode it, when you look at it as a different layer, you actually see that it's composed by different kind of things. Text label, there will be a screen there for text protections. There will be images, which is aligned to the right side, and then there will be a base color for the card, which is able to create a seamless visual effect when combined with the image. So this information should be provided by designer to you, because when you just look at the static mockup, you will not be able to understand how this card is constructed if the designer is just giving you the assets. So that's very important. If you don't understand how this UI is actually constructed in terms of the layering, definitely go back to the designer. It's not something that developers should figure out. Of course, this is the combined effect. Then let's talk about the assets itself. So of course, we built Fabulous for about 3 to 4 years. And we have every assets in PNGs most of the time, and also SVG. But most of the assets are in PNGs. It's a good format. It gives a best visual quality. But over time, we found that we have this assets folder that have a very large size, which is about 46 megabytes, which is something that we want to address because we know some users actually tend to not download certain app because the app size is larger. So we try to compress it a little bit more to try to see what kind of things that we can achieve. So this is what we do. So we first look at the images. If those images or icons requires transparency, we will keep it at PNG. But if it's solid images that doesn't require transparency information, we will convert them to JPEG. But of course, if you direct convert PNG to JPEG, what you can expect is JPEG have a larger file size, which is strange. So what we go further is actually also come up with a comparison between different level of qualities for compressions. So we end up with the quality, 90% quality for PNGs and 85% for JPEG, which is, I mean, for us, the best balance between visual quality and file size. And the result is really great because we managed to save more than 50% of the file size for just the assets folder. So this is something that I think is really important to note or to understand, that the file size can be bigger because of all these images. So one thing, one extra information that we found is that if you found that your visual, especially those images with gradient, when you look at the devices, there seems to have a bending effect. If your designer is complaining that to you, probably it's because of the bitmap configurations. So what we found previously, some of the images we were using RGB, which is creating that strange bending effect. So if you change to ARGB, is good. So that's for design assets, where what you can expect from designer is definitely usable design assets at the proper sizes for different DPI. That's no questions. Appropriate format, JPEG, PNG, SVGs. These assets usage should be properly documented or communicated so that developers doesn't have to figure out how to achieve that piece of UI. And definitely, of course, optimize. That's very important. Every piece of assets right now that we come up with for the developers is all optimized to ensure that we don't have to go through the whole optimizations process again. So that's about visual design. Then we talk about design assets. Then is that all? Of course not. So design specs. You do have to know, how things are laid out in the whole UI, what kind of spacing, what kind of size. So design specs comes in. So I'm not sure if you've seen this before. Of course, this is in material design guideline. But this is something that we did back then when we're trying to hand off the specs to the developers. So we do all these red lines, values on it, just to ensure that we communicate the padding and everything to the developers. But definitely doing all this for, for example, 20, 30 screen or 100 screen is going to be crazy. So one tool that's really, really helpful in this case is Zeppelin. Okay, if you are not using it yet, or your designer is not using it yet, I strongly recommend you to ask your designer to look into it because it's such a time saver. So what Zeppelin is? So Zeppelin is basically a tool or services that gets the design from Sketch or Photoshop. And then when they exported the screens, Zeppelin will be able to generate the specs, the red lines, for the developers or for anyone who want to look into it. So this is the UI of it. So what you can see is that it's very simple. Like you just point this one and then just mouse over to the card. You can immediately see what's the DP value between the cards and the label. You can see what kind of font is using, what kind of colors. Every information that is required for implementation is there. They even generate the XML for you to use if you want. And you can also pinpoint a certain region in the screens to discuss a little bit more, like if there's an issues implementing these, can we change this and that. So Zeppelin, definitely the one best tool that happened in this time. Definitely recommend to use it. So about design specs, definitely what you can expect from designer is complete design spec with all the usable DPSP value. And then, of course, some way to have easy communication of certain part of the screens to ensure that things are synchronized and communicated well between, excuse me, between the two parties. Then that's visual design, design assets, and design specs. So that's not all, right? Because when you design an app, user is interacting with it. So interaction design is required. You need to, certain UI need to behave as the user interact with them. So usually, designer will come up with screens, like static mockup like this. So it's not the developer's job to figure out what kind of relationship or what kind of connection it has between these screens. So what you can expect from the designer, or something that they should do it for you, is to have at least a simple screen flow diagram like this, where you can just have a look, have an overview look to see how screens are connected to each other, what kind of button is response to what kind of screens. But of course, this is still static. If you want to create an interactive mockup where you can click on it and then you will switch to another screens in a more intuitive way or more obvious way, there are some tools that you can do it, either from a simple prototype point of view or to a complex point of view. Sketch, everything, Marvel, InVision, Framer, all these tools are really good in terms of doing interactive mockup. But one of the tools that we use a lot in Fabulous is Principle. So the reason why we love it is because it's pretty easy to learn and it's very powerful. And the result is really, really high quality, where it literally can't distinguish between the real app versus the prototype. So let me just show you the UI on Principle. So what you can see is, like you have different screens connected to each other. What's the best thing in Principle is that you are able to adjust the timeline for each component motions, so to create a very believable interactions or a very believable animations in the app. So what's the workflow in Principle? Fairly simple. You start the design in Sketch, you import it into Principle as an image layer, then you create interactive mockup. From there, you can point it, tap on this element, go to these screens. And then you can do animations like moving parts from point A to point B just to show the UI behavior. And then you can export it into a different way of demoing the interaction or the animations. So one of the way, of course, is a video. So this is one of the video that we created using Principle. This is used in production, where we really send this to the developers to use, to just demo how the interaction works. So you can see that you can do ripple effect, review effect basically. Then you can interact with this scrolling, and then you can see that there's a loading animation, the loading bar. So everything of this video in this video is done using Principle. So that's pretty powerful, but the learning curve is really, really not too steep. So this is why we love Principle a lot. But of course, giving this video is not enough. When we pass the video or the file to the developers, they still have to figure out what's the timing, how these things should be animated. So this is why in Fabulous, we also work on this, what we call an animation spec, where we try to explain the animation in a narrative way so that the developers will be able to clearly understand how this particular UI element is animated. So for example, in this case, the arrow is actually moving constantly, repeatedly. So we actually come up with a spec saying that, like it changes from opacity 0 to 100 with 300 milliseconds using is-out functions, and then what next and what next. So all these things is very easy to convert in code, which I will show you later. That's the thing that the developer told me. It's very simple, and then it's very easy to understand. So that's only for one small part of the animation. So what if it's transitions that involve quite a lot of things, like you see on the second screen, things are coming in a different timing. So besides the narrative way, of course, as I mentioned just now, where you come up with all the specs, opacity 0 to 100, position in DP, we also come up with this very simple timeline view, where the developer will be able to see what is the sequence of the animations happening. Like, okay, element number 1 and number 5 happen first. And then you will animate it 300 milliseconds, but with delay for 200 milliseconds, the number 2 elements start animating. So this view actually helps a lot in terms of giving the ideas to the developers how such a transition can be combined together to become a very complete experience. So this is what we do in Fabulous, and so far it works out quite well. I think the developers appreciating all this extra information, which is actually we as a designer already have, because when we design the animation, we design the interaction, we already have the information. It's just about exposing all this information to the developers. So as I said just now, some of the things that when we say in a narrative way, like delay for 100 milliseconds, it's just about using set start delay. Like for example, if you do the scaling, you can do the initiate state and then you animate it to 1.0. So that's really, really in a very direct conversion way. And of course, animation will not complete without async functions or async curves. As a designer, we used to the way to say is out, is in, is both, or all these terms. But in Android, of course, when the designer says is out, definitely it's about linear out, slow in, and is in is fast out, linear in. So this spec is actually already in mature design, where you can just refer to it. But let me just give you a quick recap which one to use when you talk about async curve. So when you have an object that moves across the screen, so it's moving from point A to point B, use fast out, slow in. If you have an object entering the screen from outside, linear out, slow in, and if the objects that exit the screens, fast out, linear in. So that's a cheat sheet that we use in Fabulous, or it's there in the material design actually. So we use this whenever there's this animation spec that probably lacking of the async curve. These are the default async for all these different situations. But of course, principle, as powerful as it is, there's still also even more powerful interaction tools there, like Framer, Kite Compositor, and also in Vision Studio. I get a chance to play with it. It's a closed beta right now. It's pretty good, but for me, I still love Principle a lot. Very easy, very easy to produce high quality interaction mockup. So interaction design, what you can expect as a developers from designer is first the basic one, screen flow diagram. Okay, it's no longer the time where the designer just provide you static mockups and then you just figure out how to connect them. That's not the way. You should not figure it out. Then of course, high quality interactive mockup using Principle or using Framers, whichever software is possible. To show what kind of idea that they have in terms of interaction, in terms of transition, in terms of animations. And of course, what it will be best is, of course, they will be able to provide you the ready-to-use animation spec. So you don't have to figure out the timing. You just need to implement it, plug in the values, and it should work as it is. So that's what I thought about interaction design specs. Then, of course, if you still remember, of course, in the loading screen just now, you see repeating animations. So the last part of it is animation design. So this is basically the animation that you see in the loading screens. So to achieve this, definitely, you can definitely achieve this, with raw coding and everything, but it requires a lot of effort from both designer and developers. So to produce this, definitely we are using the new tools coming out from Airbnb, the Lottie. It's definitely one of the best thing happened as well in this time. So it's a mobile library for Android and also iOS that parse the After Effects animations, and you can export it as JSON. And then what's good is that this JSON is really lightweight, and also if you design it well, it's in a vector format, so you can scale it up, scale it down without losing any quality. So that's what we use with the loading animations. Then how's the flow looks like, okay? So for me, of course, I prefer to create an illustration in Sketch, so there's an extra step for me. But if you're good at Illustrator, if your designer able to design the illustration in Illustrator, That's good because you can just export the vectors into After Effects, okay? And then you can start animating the loading or whatever things inside the After Effects. Animate them and then export it using this plugin called Body Moving. So, and body moving is very important because without body moving, actually Lottie will not happen. So using body moving, export it as a JSON file that can use in Lottie. So what the designer should provide you is just one JSON file that it's already included the vectors, the animations, so you can just use it. It's fairly simple from the feedback of the developers in Fabulous. It can also be exported as animated vector drawables, which have the advantage of having high performance in Android. But it's also lack of certain features that Lottie have, so it depends on the situation. You can choose the format. So some of the tips in creating these Lottie animations, when you first looking at it, you probably it's written there in the guideline, of course, in the Lottie guideline, but you do need to figure out when you start working on Lottie. So some of the tips that I learned along the way is, if you have a, let's say you want to animate certain part in this size, let's say 330 dp. So that means in After Effects, you have to create the size, the composition size in the same value, so 230 pixels. So that's how you can create a Lottie file that actually scalable and also lightweight, because you definitely have to make sure that they are vectors, so they are scalable. And of course, Lottie actually takes care of the sizes, so it will scale up for different DPI screen density. And of course, one of the things that's pretty lacking, or something that trying to have to play around, work around, is not all the After Effects features are supported in Lottie. So like things that, designers using After Effects love to use, like expressions and all the stuff, it's not directly supported in Lottie. So it's something that you need to make sure that it works on a mobile. So definitely make sure that you test the animation on a mobile phone instead of just the web, because web is rendering it differently compared to the mobile version. And of course, like material design, you have these very delightful icon animations. So to create all this animation, there's a tool done by an ex-Googler, of course. Shapeshifter is a very good tool, very simple to use. If you have some idea about icon animations, definitely do that. Use Shapeshifter. It can produce this AVD, of course, animated vector drawables, which you can use. And we recently just started to use it to produce some of the animations, like the animations in Fab. It works really well, and it's fairly simple to use. So this is something that I think for animation design, like the kind of repeating animations or icon animations, these are the things that designer already having the tools to create them. So what you can expect from the designer is just, in terms of Lottie, just a JSON file. In terms of icon animation like this, it's just an AVD file, and it should work as intended. So animation design, of course, you should expect from designer a demo, how the animation should be used. Let's say there's a repeating animation for loading, where it should be placed, how it should look like. And then, of course, the relevant files, like JSON or the AVD files for implementation. Then, of course, Lottie is also pretty advanced in a way that you can link your loading progress to the animations. So you can say that if, let's say, the loading successful, you can proceed with this. If the loading is not successful, you can go back to the previous frames or stuff like that. So it's pretty powerful. So if it's something that your designer actually have an idea to do this, a very different way of presenting the status or conditions, definitely they are the one who should provide you the information, because definitely this is not something that you should have to figure out as a developers, because it's going to take a lot of time, and it's probably not implemented as intended. So Let's recap, talk about visual design, design assets, design specs, interaction design, and animation design. So that's about design tools, okay? That's pretty much cover everything, I hope, that what you can expect from designer. But let's talk a little bit from the designer point of view. What are the things as developers like you can help or can behave, can do to make the designer feel like home, and also can also help them to push to the next level to actually help to close the gap between the designer and developers. So that's purely from the designer point of view, but I think it's pretty valid. So of course, developers, please, definitely it's not your job to figure out the design specs. If, let's say, you're having these issues, go back to the designer and provide you with everything, or at least most of the things that you need for development. Because as a designer, we are responsible for all the design specs and all the design assets. So that should happen during the design handoff. Of course, as a developers, I think, please try to communicate with the designer, of course, and to ensure that both of you are speaking the same language. What I found sometimes is that the designer doesn't even know what is fab, what is snack bar, what is ripple effect. I mean, because designer coming from different background, like print, advertisement. So some of them might not familiar with the terms. Some of them are not familiar with the digital product. So it's something that you should, talk to them, communicate, and these guys are not speaking the same language. So, send them the material design guideline, for example, as a start, just to study about what's it about in terms of design in Android. Then, of course, I think one thing is, if you have any question at all related to the design, just ask. Just ask the designer. Definitely one thing that trying to avoid is to avoid assumptions. Because a lot of time, when you assume these things should happen this way, then the designer have different ideas, and then there's a mismatch of expectation for a certain UI or for certain interaction. So if you have any question at all, in Fabulous, we say that if you just have any question, there's no stupid questions. If you have any question at all, or if you want a question about the design decision, it's fine. You can just ask. Okay, we will explain to you why it should done this way. And sometimes, what we actually found is that through the questions from the developers, it seems that, hey, yeah, that sounds like a good alternative as well. So that's something that happening in both parties, and with just only one common goal, which is to create the best product for your company or startups. So definitely avoid assumptions. If you have any question at all, just ask. Your designer should answer the questions. Of course, you do have to understand also, designers are not coders. So sometimes they do not speak that much of logic, as like you guys as the developers. So always when you have a chance, when you look on a UI, maybe the designer doesn't know what kind of constraint is there, what kind of limitation is there. Definitely provide input to the designer to let them understand what's possible. And if, let's say, certain idea of them is really, really tricky to do, or it's really impossible, you can suggest alternative as well. Like maybe you see some of the app is doing something else. You say, hey, is this a feasible solution for this problem? And that sparked a very healthy discussion between the two parties and achieve a good product experience. And yeah, as I said, understand that most of the designer doesn't speak logic or speak codes. I actually have a designer friend. He just told me that when I look at code, I feel like fainting. So that's something that I feel a bit surprised, but I do believe that some designers actually have this kind of fear when they look at code, because they do not know how to handle it. They do not understand anything at all. So definitely understand that some designer doesn't speak at all, like on the logics and stuff like that. So definitely help them out. Speak like and explain it like I'm a 5. Like don't use jargon. Just say, if let's say the designer have some questions, about certain part, try to explain in a very plain, simple English, and to ensure that they actually understand what's going on there, what kind of constraint is there, so they will be able to come up with better design solutions. And of course, I think one of the things that sometimes when I talk to developers, they have these issues or they have this problem saying that I'm just developing whatever is being told. And I think it's a bad thing. I think as a designer and developer as well, you definitely try to find opportunity to understand the business goal. Why certain thing needs to be designed this way, why certain thing needs to be implemented in this way. And because it's important because everyone is having the common goal, which is to create the best product for the users. So not knowing the business goal, and then when you're trying to do something, and probably you a little bit disagree with it, and you will feel frustrated when you keep working on that because you don't agree with that, or you do not know what kind of direction or what kind of goal actually meant for the design or the implementation. So definitely, if there's a chance or opportunity, always get to know the business goal so you feel a little bit, getting more ownership on the things that you ship to the users. Then, one thing that I definitely say, the same thing applies to designer as well. We should observe and also understand a little bit in terms of the beauty of coding. So for engineers or for developers, definitely when you have a chance, when you come across a design article, don't close it. You may just read through it just to understand a little bit of the, the beauty of design. Why design is there, what kind of things the designer is talking about. It's not something that you should use, but just to get yourself updated with what's happening around in the design industries is also good because you probably can have a little bit of common language talking to the designer, and you can be best friend. So just to recap, what I mentioned just now, of course, these are the things that designer can do for you because the design tool is already out there. It's available in the market. So visual design, so what you can expect is consistent design, in the base resolutions, but also with responsive in mind. Creating design assets for the developers to use, optimize, this usage documentation is there for you. Interaction design, of course. They can use Principle, for example, to come up with the whole chain of the screens, how things are interacting, how transition works between this screen to that screens, and provides you all the information that you need, like the demo, the animation spec, how the transition should work. Should you use ripple effect? Should you use a reveal effect? All those stuff. And also animation design. This is one of the things that really excited me last year when they come out. I think last year is really exciting because before that we've been figuring out how to actually create some fancy animations to put into the app. And we tried certain things, but it's just very involving. So having Lottie in it, it's really, really nice. After Effects, it's a little bit hard to learn, but it's a very powerful tool. So once you master it, it's actually, you can create a lot of very, very nice animation. So that's the 4 pillars. So what's next? What's next about design tool? So I come across this tweet from Mark. He just says, maybe one day we can just publish to production from our design tool. Sure, when you design tool support, blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. So, in a way, I can understand there's in this ideal world where when the designer come up with something and then this directly can be used in the production and then everything can just ship it. But I'm not too sure like in the near future this is going to happen. Flutter seems like a very good candidate for it, but we will see. But before that happens, I think as a designer, what we should do is to understand every basic things or everything that the developer needs, provide them all these things first, understanding the whole part before we're moving on from creating these ideal design tools that can go from design phase to production. So with that, I end my talk. So my name is Taylor Ling. I haven't introduced myself. I'm coming from a Fabulous team. I'm co-founder and designer in Fabulous. I'm also a GDE in product design. So for Fabless, if you are interested to work with us, okay, we are hiring. We are hiring Android developers. We love Android. We start Fabless in Android for a couple of years. Currently, we use Android as a test bed for a lot of different features that we will port to iOS version. So you can see how we love Android. So if you're interested, you can go to this URL just to see the details. And if you're interested enough, send us a resume and we can talk. So with that, thank you very much. I hope you bring home some information that you can use. Thank you.
Hi, is it on?
Yes.
So there is usually a third element in the chain, which is manager. So how would you convince the importance of having interactive design in the app? Like I see Fabulous is like really rich interactively.
Yeah.
But most of the managers just convince team, well, not convince, but force team to do MVP and then move on. But what's your personal feeling about the value that interactions add to
Yeah, of course. I mean, again, it's a famous answer, it depends. But like what you mentioned is now, if it's an MVP, it's a different story. Because like, for example, in Fabulous MVP, we don't have all this fancy interaction. We just wanted it to have the baseline standard experience that we can come up with for the users to use. So that if the managers is saying that not much interaction there because you should just focus on creating out the MVP, that I think makes sense. But let's say you are already an established product and you try to improve the experience for the users. I don't know, like for us, we always refer to those very high profile and famous apps that loved by users a lot, like Google Apps, Facebook, and all this, Facebook, and all these apps that showing them the fact that all these small details, all these very nice interaction experience actually enhance a lot in terms of experience, of course, and also brand retention, where you just recognize this interaction and this kind of experience just in your app. So I think that's probably one of the ways that you can use example to show to your manager things that, hey, we can just start small, like just one small part of it to have this very signature interaction. And then from there, you can grow from there.
Yeah. Thank you for your talk. I was wondering, you're showing us to convert some PNG to JPEG, but did you try to use WebP format?
We did try the WebP format. Actually, yeah, that's a good question. Thank you very much for asking that. We actually did quite a lot of experiments. We spent quite some time trying to find the best format for us as well, WebP, JPEG, PNGs. But what we found is that JPEG, it's still having the slight advantage compared to the WebP format. Although in the same file size, of course, WebP will be able to display it a little bit better. But the tooling to convert PNGs to JPEG is much more easier. We use this tool called Image Optim. It's a Mac app. You just drop it in and it converts it. So it's fairly simple. I haven't seen similar tools for WebP yet. So yeah, this is why for design team we decided to just go for JPEG. And the good thing is that when the developers telling us that if you just give us PNG or JPEG, it will just work as intended. So yeah, definitely JPEG. So that's our story. But definitely, I think WebP, there will be some potential there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.